Hi, I'm Lieutenant General Gordon Sumner Jr., retired in the United States Army, and an old-time resident of Grand Lake. And I would like to give you a few of my remembrances of Grand Lake and how I came to be a resident up here. And it starts in 1946, after World War II. I had accepted a regular Army commission, and I was posted to Japan, and I was walking down the streets of Tokyo, and I was introduced to Major General Orlando Ward. And Ward was from Colorado, and I was from New Mexico, and so we had sort of a common background there. And he asked me, rather than being assigned as I was to the 1st Cavalry Division in Japan, he said, you ought to come with me to Korea where the action is going to be. So being young and footless and fancy-free, I accepted the invitation to go to Korea, where General Ward was to command the 6th Infantry Division, which was responsible for the southern half of the American zone in Korea. So that's where, and I went as his aide-de-camp, and that's where I met the Wards. And if I go fast forward now several years after I came home from the Korean War in 1951, General Ward invited me to come up, and because I had a 30-day leave, having been a prisoner of war in Korea, they gave me a little extra time, and he invited myself and my wife and my only child, Ward at that time, to come up and be his guest here at Grand Lake, with the proviso that I would work 2 days on a room he was putting on the Hannington house over here on the lake, but on the 3rd day I could go fishing. So I thought that was a good deal, and I accepted it. So I came up here with my wife and my only child at that time, and we became, in a few days, enamored with Grand Lake. And I had always thought I wanted to have a permanent home, and not in New Mexico, but in somewhere north of New Mexico in the mountains. And my wife and I decided that Grand Lake would be a wonderful place to have a, quote, permanent home. And so I started looking around, and I happened to run into Mr. Harrington, who owned the property here near the Wards. And Mr. Harrington, I think, was the owner and founder of Crane Plumbing Company. So I was up one morning very early, and I met Mr. Harrington down on the dock and asked him if he would sell me one of his cottages that he had there. And he said, no, Captain. He said, I'm going to tear those down. But he said, if you want to buy a property, you ought to go over and buy the Spider House, which was a house that was in a derelict condition. It had a fire and had been partially blown up. And he finished up by saying, he said, if you don't buy it, I am. I being Mr. Harrington. So I went back and related this conversation to General Ward, and he said, oh, you better go buy that place. If Mr. Harrington thinks it's worth buying, it's worth buying. So to make a long story short, there were some friends here, Charlie Thomas, who was a lawyer, and that day I, with Charlie, put together a contract, and we bought the house from Helen and Lon Osborne which were only one of about 32 people that owned that house. So we had to have a quitclaim title suit and one thing and another. But anyhow, the house had been, the old man Greg that had owned it had tried to blow up a rock and blew all the windows out in the house and set it on fire. And there really wasn't any substantial damage done to the basic structure and the foundations. So I was able to go over and get Clyde Eslick to come over, and once I had bought the house, which was consummated that afternoon. Now all this was done in one day. And Clyde Eslick put a roof, which I'm looking at it now. That roof is still up there. And we started putting window panes back in the house and trying to put it in some sort of condition. So in the next few years, General Ward, who I'd helped him with his house, he gave me substantial help down here in getting this house in shape, and we were able to move into it, I think, probably the summer of 1954. I had to put the electrical wire in the plumbing, and I had a well, and we didn't have city water, and so it was in rather primitive condition, but it was livable. And we came up here to go skiing in the wintertime, and that became home for my children. I didn't want my children hanging around the officers club in the summertime. I wanted them to have a real home, and we always rented a horse here for so that they could learn to ride, and they learned to fish. And to this day, my children feel this is home. So that's where we are today, which is the 12th of September 2009. So anyhow, that's how we came to be up here. And
how did it happen to be called the Spider House?
Well, that my wife at that time, because they had the gingerbread on the porches, and because the children thought the house was haunted, it became the Spider House, and that name has stuck over the years. And right now, people come by. It's sort of what should I say, a local attraction for people, because it is a classic piece of architecture. Particularly the bay window was the first one made, I understand, up in this part of Colorado. And the term the Spider House, incidentally, the house was full of spiders, amongst other animals, squirrels. We had a big porcupine that lived under the house when we moved in, and we had to disabuse him of living under there. And anyhow, it's a fabulous piece of Americana here, and they wanted to register it in the National Registry of Historical Places, but my son disabused me of that, because once you do that, you lose control of your property. And I have since sold the house to the old man Harrington's grandson, Martin, who they loved the place too, and Martin's father, who was a colonel in the Marine Corps, used to come down in the evening and sit, and we'd have a drink together and talk about World War II. He had quite a record in World War II. Had a very distinguished career. So this is all part of Grand Lake.
When you came up here and vacationed in the summer, what kinds of things did you do?
Well, when we came up here in the summertime, we worked because we had to get that house in livable condition, and there were all sorts of things wrong with it, and I was one of the major contributors to Grand Lake Plumbing, Gordon Spitzmiller, and but it wasn't all work. We hiked a lot. I climbed Long's Peak at least once or twice every summer with some of the children here. We joined the yacht club, and we had with Fletcher Thomas, we had a e-scow that we raced, and we did a lot of playing as well as working. And of course, I love to fish and hike, and my wife at that time held classes. She was a great canoeist, and she held classes for the young people here in canoeing, and so we were really became part of the Grand Lake community.
Did you ever live up here full time?
No, we never lived here full time. We tried to come up here at least twice a year, once in the winter to ski, and of course in the summer. And that one of the wonderful things about the Army, I was being constantly deployed overseas, but when I would come back, I always got a 30-day leave. Now, most of the officers in the Army, when they get a 30-day leave, they don't know what to do with it. First of all, they can't afford a 30-day leave, but I always had home to come to, and General Ward was always very generous and being sure that the house was looked after, and that the Wards were really are not only mentors for myself and my wife, but for my two children.
Now, I can remember you had llamas, or a llama.
Yeah, I had later on, I always liked to have a horse up here, and then I was one of the first people to bring a llama up here, and I used the llama for packing, and the llama was sort of a house pet. He was housebroken, and Oral Burtis and I used to go backpacking with the llama. Of course, the llama took the pack, and they're wonderful pack animals, and so that was the first llama up here. And the National Park Rangers were really interested because all their horses would spook when they saw the llama, and they knew that the llamas were going to be the wave of the future up here, and they wanted to use my llama to accustom their horses to the smell and the sight of the llama. So that was one thing we did. And of course, with the Spider House, I had a stable and the property here, so it was, and so I used to keep a horse and a llama here together, and so that was all part of the Grand Lake experience.
Are you familiar with the problems that happened with the Gregg family that built the Spider House?
Oh yeah, well, I was very familiar with that because when we went to buy the house, they were telling us, well, the house is haunted, and these children were killed up on the upper porch, and you're going to buy this haunted house, and anyhow, I got the various accounts of what happened up there from different people, from Clyde and Grace Eslick, and then from Lon and Helen Osborne, and of course the McCrarys were sitting. Now the McCrarys were the blind couple that lived here. They were on this thing, and so we have pictures of that, and I want Holly to show you that. And anyhow, there was a lot of what should I say, mythology that went with the house, and apparently the old man had ordered a what they call a mail order bride who was a school teacher, and we're talking about the late 1890, somewhere in there, and this lady came out, and they had 3 or 4 children. I think there were 4, but anyhow, This woman, because of the isolation and the lack of any human activity up here at that time, she became very depressed. And apparently one day when the old man took his eldest son out, apparently to go fishing, she took the other 3 children, and I'm not sure whether there were 2 or 3. I've heard various accounts. I think 3 is the number, and she killed the children with a shotgun up on the upper porch there, and I think the blood stains are still up there. And anyhow, the old man would never go back in the house. He lived over here in the shed. So there's a lot. As I say, I got various accounts from various people. I'm not sure exactly what the truth is on it, but it was known as I guess there are several Grand Lake massacres, but that was one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yes. Oh, yes. Now, what brings you up here this weekend?
Well, my daughter is getting married. Is married. She was married yesterday up on the property owned by Richard McCrary and Jane. That is part of the Cairns property up there, which is all part of Grand Lake history. And they were married yesterday, and so I came up to give the bride away again. And Stilly, my daughter now, is 56 years old. And I'm 85, so it gives you a little of the time here. Before I came up to Grand Lake, I was assigned back to Korea. I spent 2 years, 1946 to 48, with General Ward. And I came back from Korea. I married the young lady that I met in Korea, and we had the son. And immediately, 1950 in June, when the North Koreans invaded South Korea, I was immediately ordered back to Korea. And would you believe it, the 1st Cavalry Division, and I was the artillery liaison officer to the 1st Battalion of the 7th Cavalry Regiment, which is Custer's old outfit. And as we made our way up to the Yalu River, we were met by the Chinese, and in that, I actually, with Task Force Dolphin, we made it to the Yalu River, which was frozen, and of course there were hundreds of thousands of Chinese coming across the river, and we fell back, and I joined the 7th Cavalry Regiment, and we were overrun on the night of 27th November by Chinese horse cavalry, which they were mounted on horses and mules and camels and donkeys, anything you can think of, and they were American trained with American weapons, which made, when they overran us, that made the battle very confusing. And in that encounter, my battalion was overrun, and over 1,000 of us, there were 21 survivors, of which I was one. And I was wounded repeatedly and captured, and the Chinese were trying to evacuate me north, and the Chinese at that time turned over all American prisoners to the Soviets. And I knew that, and I made up my own mind that I was not going to do that. If I had to die trying, I was going to escape. Well, fortunately, our wonderful United States Air Force came along, and they started strafing the column of prisoners. And I'm sure they didn't know. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. I don't know what the Chinese thought. They must have, and maybe they had red flags out. But anyhow, the P-51s attacked the column of Chinese, and it killed a lot of the Chinese, and I'm sure they killed a lot of the prisoners. But in that chaos, I was able to get away, and I made my way back with a corporal that I was one of our survivors, and we were picked up by the 8th Cavalry Regiment later on that day. So I'm in the military parlance, I'm not only a prisoner of war, but I'm also an escapee, which I don't know what that does for you, except I felt very fortunate. And so when...
What rank were you at that time?
I'd just been promoted to captain when I was captured. And fortunately, the Chinese treated American prisoners much better than the North Koreans. North Koreans just shot the prisoners. They took no prisoners, but the Chinese did. The Chinese were better trained, and incidentally they spoke some English, not much, but they didn't abuse me, and they didn't give me any medical treatment either, but that was all right. So that's one story that comes out of the Korean War. After I was recovered, I was so badly wounded, and I had pneumonia, and I had multiple gunshot wounds and frostbite and so on and so forth. So I was evacuated to the Tokyo Army General Hospital, and there I was, my records, I was eligible to go home. But General Biderlanden, who was the G1 for General MacArthur, was a good friend of General Ward's. And 2 years earlier, I had been posted from Korea back to Tokyo to help write General MacArthur's message to Congress. Well, General Biderlanden, when he saw my record, I guess every day he saw the records of the POWs, he found out I was down in the hospital, and he came down and got me out of the hospital, and I had bandages, and I had no clothing. Incidentally, I went through a whole procedure because I had no way of proving who I was except through fingerprints. So once they decided I really was who I said I was, General Biderlanden took me over and said, "We need you as a speechwriter for General MacArthur." So I spent the next 6 months as a speechwriter for General MacArthur, and he left on one day in May, and I left the next day. I was eligible to go home, but they kept me there because they had the authority to do that. And I wasn't, obviously I wanted to go home, but on the other hand, being a speechwriter for General MacArthur was what I consider to be an honor. And so when I came home in May, that was late May, I've forgotten the exact day, but anyhow, that's when General Ward said, "Why don't you come up here and help me with the house?" So that's the story behind that. Yeah, Grand Lake is very fortunate because the upper class of Denver in the late 1800s came up here, and they bought up the land around the lake here. Now, when you see what happened to Aspen or Vail, and those communities, and Pepke came over here, wanted to develop Grand Lake, and they said we're not into that, and so the Grand Lake community has been bypassed by the high-end ski developers. They want to develop a ski run on Shadow Mountain here because there was one, a small one here at one time. But Grand Lake is, and during the 50s and 60s, I used to hear the local people complain about the fact that they were not being involved in all this money that was coming in. And I'm sure when they look back on it, they were lucky they weren't, because if this had turned into some big development here, Grand Lake would have lost its culture and its uniqueness and a lot of its beauty. I mean, the beauty of the area has not been defouled the way, I remember going over to Aspen, it was nothing but a dry gulch. Vale is not much better. I mean, Grand Lake with the lake and with Baldy and the park and everything. I mean, for a developer coming in there, if he could have taken over the south side of the lake, scarfed it off and put up big hotels and condominiums, that would have been a dream. And Pepke had that dream, but the local people were not about to do it, and the people that own the properties here, and I won't go into the names, but that own the properties here were not about to sell out. They could have made us fortune. That they didn't sell out to do that sort of thing. So the area has kept basically its unique, quiet culture, and they've kept the animals come and go, and the fishing and the hiking and the cross-country skiing. There's always been a problem between the motorheads, the people that want to do everything on a motor, whether it's in the water or on the snow, and the people that want to do it by foot. That tension still exists, I'm sure, but somehow they've been able to survive the decades now. I've watched it from the 1950s to 2010. Well, that's almost 60 years, and it's still a nice place. I knew that old man Gregg had been in the prospecting business, but I found in the house a vial of mercury, and I didn't know what to do with that. It was extremely heavy, as you know. And then out in the drying shed, which is outside of the house there were 10 sticks of runny dynamite. And apparently old man Gregg had used that dynamite to try and blow the big rock over there. And I had to call the sheriff to come up here because runny dynamite is terribly unstable. And then I had all the pans and stuff that he used in his prospecting, and I still have the rocker, which is out here in front of the house. And then I was told by Stoddard White, who was very much into he worked up the Wolverine mine. He said that whenever old man Gregg left town, that people used to follow him because he was obviously coming back with gold, which he would then cash in and get the cash. So the word was out in the community that he had a load somewhere up there where he went to get gold, but he was very clever in concealing it. So anyhow, that was all part of the mythology that went on. And of course, there was a big sign on the side of the house. Gregg, the law west of Granby. he was the justice of the peace here, and Fletcher and the Thomas boys used to, when they got a ticket, they had to pay it off to Judge Gregg here, and Gregg was quite a student of Shakespeare, and he always quoted Shakespeare to them, which made an impression on the boys. So there was a lot of what should I say, tales and mythology that the Spider House and Judge Gregg and all this and and I've got the bullet moles. I mean, they did. I mean, it was a very primitive society, and they made their own fish hooks. They made their own nails. They poured their own bullets. I mean, they did not go to Walmart or Gart to get to get what they needed to hunt and fish with. So it was great for me personally, but it was also great for my children.